Hello, Ellie. I hope that you're feeling better by the time that you're getting some of your friends to read a book to you. And I'm sorry that you've been in the hospital. Just want you to know that your friends here at We School have been praying for you. So today I wanted to read you a book from one of my favorite all-time characters. You may know him. His name is Curious George. And so I thought that I would read you Curious George who goes to the hospital, since you've been in the hospital a little bit. So listen, it said, this is George. He lived with his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He was a good little monkey, but he was always curious. And today, George was curious about a big box on the man's desk. What could it be? George could not resist. He simply had to open it. It was full of funny little pieces of all sorts of shapes and colors. George took it out. He looked at it. It looked like a piece of candy. Maybe it was candy. Maybe he could eat it. George put a piece in his mouth, and before he knew it, he swallowed it. A while later, the man with the yellow hat came home. Why, George, he said, I see you've already opened the box with the jigsaw puzzle. It was supposed to be a surprise for you. Well, let's go to work putting it together. Finally, the puzzle was finished. Well, almost. One piece was missing. The man looked for it everywhere, but he could not find it. That's strange, he said. It was a brand new puzzle. Well, it can't be helped. Maybe we'll find it in the morning. Let's go to bed now, George. The next morning, George did not feel well. He had a tummy ache, and he didn't even want to eat his breakfast. The man was worried, so he went to the telephone and he called Dr. Baker. I'll be over as soon as I can, said Dr. Baker. First, Dr. Baker looked down George's throat and he felt his tummy. And then he took out his stethoscope and listened. I'm not sure what's wrong, he said. We better take George over to the hospital and take an x-ray. I'll call and let them know that you were coming. Don't worry, George, said the man while they were driving to the hospital. You've been there before when you broke your leg. Remember how nice the doctors and the nurses was? George held his big rubber ball tight as they walked up the hospital steps. The nurse took him down a long hallway to a room where she gave George something to drink that looked white and tasted sweet. It was called barium. The nurse explained, it will help the doctors to find out what is wrong with you, George. In the next room stood a big table, and the doctor was putting on a heavy apron. And then he gave the man one just like it. And George was curious. Would he get one too? No, he did not. You get on the table, George, the doctor said. I'm going to take some x-ray pictures of your insides. And he pushed a button and there was a funny noise. There, now you can get up and we'll have the x-rays developed right away. Now let's see, there's something there. The doctor said while they were looking at the x-ray, while it looks like, I think it's the piece of the missing jigsaw puzzle from yesterday, said the man. Well, 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 said the doctor. At least we know what's wrong with our little patient. I'll tell Dr. Baker right away. George, you'll have to stay at the hospital for a few days. They'll put a tube down your throat and get the piece out. It will only be a small operation. I'll call the nurse and she'll take you to the admitting office. Many people were waiting outside the office. George had to wait too. Look, Betsy, the woman sitting next to the little girl, there's Curious George." Betsy looked up for a moment, but she did not even smile. Betsy had never been to the hospital before, and she was scared. Finally, it was George's turn. A pretty young nurse took him to the next room. "Ma, how many rooms and how many nurses are here?" One nurse wrote down a lot of things about George, his name, his address, and what was wrong with him. Another nurse put a bracelet around his wrist. "It's your name, George," she said, "so everybody will know who you are." Then the pretty young nurse came back. "My name is Carol," she said, "and I'm going to take you to your room now. We call it the children's ward, and we're going to put you to bed. And there'll be a lot of children to keep you company." And so it was. There were a lot of children in the room, and some were up and around, and others were in their bed with a doctor or a nurse looking after them. Dave was having a blood transfusion. Steve had a leg bandage and was sitting in a go-kart, and Betsy was in bed looking sad. George got into the bed next to Betsy. George was glad when he was in the bed at last. His tummy was hurting again, and the man sat with him for a while. "Now, I have to leave, George," he finally said, "and I'll be back first thing in the morning before they take you to the operating room. And Nurse Carol will tuck you in when it's time for you to sleep." And then he left, and George just sat there and cried. As he promised, the man was back early the next morning. The nurses were keeping George very busy. One nurse was taking his temperature, one taking his blood pressure, one giving him a pill to make you sleepy, George, she said, and one was getting ready to give him a shot. "Is it going to hurt?" George said, but only for a moment. She took his arm, and George let out a scream. "But the needle hadn't even touched you yet," the nurse said laughingly. "There, it's done. That wasn't so bad, was it?" "No, really it was not. Anyway, it's over now." By the time the attendant came with a stretcher to wheel him to the operating room, George was getting sleepy. He tried hard to stay awake. He was curious to see what would happen next. He could see the big table and the bright light over, and the doctors and the nurses all around. They had caps on their heads and masks over their face. Only their eyes were showing. One of the doctors winked at George and patted his head. It was Dr. Baker, who had been at the house when all of this had started. He looked funny with a mask on his face, and then George was fast asleep. When George woke up, he did not know what had happened. He didn't even know where he was. And when he saw Nurse Carol, it was all done. She said, "They got the piece out, and in a day or two, you'll be running around again." And the man brought him a picture book, but George felt sick and dizzy. His throat was hurting too. He was not even curious about the new book. He closed his eyes again. "Well, let him sleep," said Nurse Carol. "The more he sleeps, the better." The next morning, George felt better. He even ate a dish of ice cream, and Dr. Baker came in to see him, and the man, of course, came too. And Betsy was watching him this time. She seemed a little less sad, but she still didn't smile. Steve wheeled his go-kart over to George's bed. "Tomorrow I'll be able to get up and walk," they said. "Boy, I can hardly wait." "I'll take you to the playroom now, George," Nurse Carol said the next morning, "and in the afternoon your friend will come and take you home. The playroom was full of children, and a lady showing Betsy how to use finger paints. There were all sorts of things to play with, even a puppet theater that was just the thing for George. He had 4 hands, and he could handle 4 puppets at the same time. George gave a real puppet show with a dragon and a clown and a bear and a policeman. The children laughed and shouted. Even Betsy, for the first time, she smiled a little. And there was a TV set in the playroom and also a record player. And George was curious. If he climbed on the record player and turned on the switch, would it go round and round like a merry-go-round? It did. It started slowly, and then it got faster and faster. And whoopee! George lost his balance and went sailing through the air. Luckily, George landed on a soft cushion, and the children cheered, and Betsy smiled again. And George was so funny. But the play lady picked George up. "That's enough for now," she said. "You better take a nap before lunch. We have a big day ahead of us, and the mayor is coming to visit the hospital today. And later today, you'll be going home, George." When George woke up, Steve was taking his first steps, and the nurse was helping him, and the children were watching. And the go-kart was standing there empty, and George was curious. He looked at it, and then he climbed on. And then he grabbed the wheels, and then, while nobody was looking, he wheeled the go-kart right out of the room. George could make the go-kart very fast. It was fun. Down the hall he went, and now the nurses had noticed that he was gone and came running after him. "George, George," she shouted. But George was so excited that he wheeled around the corner and down the ramp to the floor below, and where the men were pushing lunch carts, and a lot of doctors and nurses were showing the mayor around. And George tried to stop, but it was too late. Wham! The go-kart landed right in the middle of everything. Lunch carts tumbled, spinach and scrambled eggs and strawberry jams were all over the floor. People fell all over each other, and George was thrown out of the go-kart and landed right in the mayor's arms. What a mess it was. "You broke all of my dishes," someone cried. "You ruined my go-kart," complained another. "What will the mayor think of it?" whispered someone else. And so it went. And suddenly, everybody looked up and listened. From above came a happy laughter, and there stood Betsy, laughing and laughing and laughing. And the children joined in, and then the mayor started laughing, and finally everybody laughed and laughed. Everybody, that is, except George. Betsy came running down the ramp and threw her arms around George and kissed him. "Don't be sad, George," she said. "The whole thing was so funny. I've never laughed so much in my life. I'm so glad that you were in the hospital with me." Now the director of the hospital spoke. "I'm sorry this happened, Mr. Mayor," he said, "but I think we'll just clean this mess up and be done with it. George," he went on, "you made a terrible mess, but you also made our sad little Betsy happy again. And it's more than anything, and it means more than anything to us. And now, let's see, your friend has just come to take you home. So goodbye, George, and take care of yourself." The children crowded around the window, waving goodbye, when George and the man with the yellow hat were finally leaving the hospital. And the car was turning into the driveway, and Nurse Carol came running after them. "Here's a little package with something that belongs to you, George," she called. "But don't open it before you're home." George was curious. Well, Who wouldn't be? The moment he reached home, he ripped off the paper, tore open the box, and there was the piece of the puzzle that had caused all the trouble. "How nice of the doctor to save it for us," said the man with the yellow hat. "And now we can finish the puzzle." The end.